You're watching Morning Live. Appreciate you choosing us as your station of choice this morning here on SABC 2 and SABC News Channel 404. Now, just trying to get hold of Professor Pierre there via Skype or even on the telephone line, because we want to talk to him about the application brought by former President Jacob Zuma and the French arms company Thales. Now, Zuma is facing charges of corruption, racketeering and money laundering relating to the controversial multi-billion rand arms deal, and that of course is back in the Pietermaritzburg High Court this week. Zuma and his co-accused Thales are arguing that the charges against them should be dropped because of the long delays in the process of prosecuting this case. Remember, Shabir Sheikh was convicted about 15 years ago, and they are putting that forward as one of the arguments for a permanent stay of prosecution. The former president also says that he's being prosecuted because of political meddling, and we want to get Professor Pierre views on this in terms of the arguments that are being put forward by the legal teams of former President Jacob Zuma, as well as the legal team representing the French arms company Thales. All right, we do have Professor Pierre on the line to us now. Professor thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thank you for having me, and sorry for the phone because of the sound issues.
Well, unfortunately, we can see you, we can hear you, so all's well that ends well. Prof, if we could start here. Former President Jacob Zuma's defense team, they are arguing that the charges of corruption, racketeering and money laundering against him should be dismissed due to delays in prosecution. And yesterday we heard the legal team of Thales advancing that argument as well. Is this a valid reason for dropping charges?
Well, the court, when they decide whether to have a permanent stay of prosecution, what they look at is whether substantively there can be a fair trial. So this is all about a fair trial matter. And the court has said in previous judgment that a delay, a very long delay, might actually compromise the fairness of the trial. But they also said if you had been complicit in delaying the trial as an accused person, that would normally count against you, and normally the court will not order a permanent stay of prosecution if you had been part of it. And especially for Mr. Zuma, that might be a problem because, of course, he had the so-called Stalingrad option, so many of the delays were actually because of his actions. And so some of the delays on the side of the NPA, but many of them on the side of Mr. Zuma. So I think that is a bit of an uphill battle for Mr. Zuma and his lawyers to overcome that fact.
Interesting you say that, Professor because Moses Kakane, appearing for former President Jacob Zuma, he actually mentioned this notion of a Stalingrad approach, asking what is that? And he also then went on to claim that you can't blame that on his client because it is not Zuma who stalled it, it's the NPA.
And so that the court, I think if that argument is accepted, then the court will obviously rule or might very likely rule in Mr. Zuma's favor. But I think the facts are a little bit against Mr. Zuma and his lawyers because if you look at the law reports, you'll see there's about 10 cases in which Mr. Zuma went to the court to try and either delay or to stop the prosecution. So it's not so easy factually to make that argument to the court. We will have to see if the court accepts it or not.
And let's just unpack what we mean by delay in this instance, because is it a delaying tactic if someone exercises their options as per the law?
Well, you can obviously do what is, if you have a real issue. The problem for Mr. Zuma is that many of the cases that he brought, he ultimately lost. And so if there's a pattern, I think, then the court might say, well, the pattern here is that you're using the court and you have a right to do that, but you're using it in a way not actually to get to justice, but to actually avoid prosecution.
So one of the arguments that Zuma's legal team has also put forward is that the case is no longer fresh. They claim that some of the witnesses may have forgotten evidence, some judges may have retired, and Thales' legal team also through Katz yesterday mentioning some of those things, saying some of the witnesses, cannot be traced. There's one that may be suffering from Alzheimer's. So how do these factors affect the prosecuting process?
Those factors are all relevant. So if you can't, if it's so long that the witnesses have all died or that the evidence have gotten lost, that clearly will mean that the trial can't go ahead. So once again, the question will be, will the court accept that those people who are not available are central to the case? If it does, then the court might rule that there is a permanent stay of prosecution. If they find, as the NPA has argued, that those witnesses that are unavailable or have Alzheimer's or so on are not actually pivotal to the case at all, and that the accused people are all there and they are still very much alive and well and so on, then the court is not going to accept the argument that there cannot be a fair trial for that reason.
Another argument, Professor De Vos, that was posited was, of course, that political meddling is one of the reasons why the former president finds himself in court once again. What's your opinion on this?
Well, I don't have to use my opinion. I can use the opinion of the Supreme Court of Appeal, which in an earlier case dealing with Mr. Zuma, the court said that even if there was political meddling, that in itself will not render the prosecution unlawful, as long as the aim of the prosecuting authority has always been to secure a conviction based on the available evidence that showed that there is a prima facie case. The lawyers in the NPA case have been saying there is such a case, so I think that is a much weaker argument than the argument of delays and the argument that the witnesses are not available.
And the argument, of course, goes on to try and make the case that it is because of this political interference that we have seen the sort of delays that we've seen. Moses Kakane for Zuma read transcripts from the so-called spy tapes in court and alluding to the fact that it was conversations about the former president between the NPA and then Scorpion's boss, and that these transcripts actually should be allowed to be used in court as evidence. So you know, does that also now muddy the waters a little further in this aspect?
Yes, I'm not sure. I know that in the case about the spy tapes judgment, the court actually said that the spy tapes are not really helpful in any way. They basically dismissed them as being irrelevant to the case. So as long as that judgment stands, we will, the High Court here will be in a difficult position because another court has already said this is not really relevant. It does not affect the fairness of the trial. So they will really have to overturn the previous decision and go against what the court has already found in the previous judgment.
And on the part of Thales, just finally, because we need to wrap this up, they argued that the former public prosecutions boss, Sean Abrams, actually relied on the wrong sections of the law in order to prosecute Thales. What's your take on that?
If that is correct, that argument was a bit difficult to follow when I looked at the feed yesterday. But if that argument is correct, that will clearly be a technical issue that will render the decision to prosecute unlawful. So the judges in the hearing yesterday didn't seem to want to bite on that argument, but I'll have to do more of a study on the actual details. But if the argument factually is correct, it clearly is a very good argument for them, and they might actually then be successful if accepted.
Professor Pierre De Vos, thanks so much for your time this morning. Professor De Vos is a constitutional law expert from the University of Cape Town, talking to us about the criminal charges against former President Jacob Zuma and French arms company Thales. And as he says, needs to go and study up on some of the aspects there that Thales also brought up yesterday, claiming that they seem to have been added on to the Zuma charge. So much to come out of this still. And of course, Thales, along with former President Jacob Zuma, are applying to the High Court in Pietermaritzburg for a permanent stay of prosecution. We're going to take a break. After that, we'll continue a conversation that started last week where